I've never been the type to believe in the supernatural. I've always chalked up strange occurrences to my overactive imagination or just simple coincidences. But the events that unfolded one summer night deep in the woods of Pennsylvania shook that belief to its core. What I experienced was far beyond anything I could have ever imagined. It all started when a group of us decided to take a weekend camping trip. A few friends from work, all of us in our mid-20s, looking for a break from the hustle and bustle of city life. We figured the deep woods would provide the perfect place for some peace and quiet, a bit of drinking, and a lot of campfire stories. None of us had ever been to these particular woods before. They were remote, untouched by civilization, and that's what made it seem perfect. We arrived late in the afternoon and set up camp near an old logging trail. The sun was low, casting a warm golden hue over the trees. There was an eerie stillness in the air, like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. None of us really paid much attention to it at the time. We just shrugged it off and went about setting up tents and gathering wood for the fire. By nightfall, the forest around us had grown dark, and we huddled around the crackling fire, enjoying the warmth and the company. The usual campfire chatter began, but then, as the night wore on, things started to feel off. The temperature dropped suddenly, and it wasn't just the chill in the air. It felt like the temperature around us had shifted, like there was something watching, something unseen. "Hey, you guys hear that?" One of my friends, Ben, asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We all stopped talking and listened. There was a strange rustling noise coming from the woods behind us. It wasn't the wind or the usual forest creatures. It sounded like something, or someone, was moving through the underbrush, deliberately. "It's probably just a deer or something," Sarah, another friend, said with a nervous laugh. She was always the skeptic, the one who tried to make light of everything. But then we heard it again. The rustling, but this time it was closer. Way too close. My skin crawled as I glanced around, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. "All right, that's enough. Who's messing around?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't want to admit that I felt a growing sense of dread creeping up my spine. No one answered, and the rustling continued. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. It was deliberate, slow, almost as if something was stalking us. "I think we should go check it out," Ben said, his voice tinged with unease. "No way," I replied, shaking my head. "It's probably just a raccoon or something. We don't need to go wandering off into the woods at this hour." But my words fell flat as we all heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. The kind of footsteps that no animal could make. They were too loud, too heavy. I felt my heart skip a beat. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, all was silent. The fire crackled, and the only sound was the wind brushing through the trees. "I'm going to take a look," Ben said, standing up and grabbing a flashlight. "Stay here, I'll be back in a minute." He walked into the darkness, the beam of his flashlight barely cutting through the thick shadows of the trees. We sat in silence, watching him disappear into the blackness. The atmosphere was oppressive, thick with the weight of something unseen. A few minutes passed, and then we heard Ben scream. A blood-curdling scream that echoed through the woods, sending chills down our spines. We jumped to our feet, panic setting in. "Ben!" I shouted, but there was no response. We rushed toward the edge of the clearing, our flashlights scanning the darkness, but Ben was nowhere to be seen. We called out to him, but the only answer we got was the wind, howling like a wolf in the distance. After what felt like an eternity, we heard Ben's voice, weak and trembling. "Help, please, help." We followed the sound of his voice, pushing our way through the dense underbrush. The further we went, the more it felt like the forest was closing in around us. The air grew thick, and the shadows seemed to twist and move. Finally, we found him. He was crouched by a large tree, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. His flashlight lay in the dirt beside him, flickering weakly. He looked like he had seen something that had broken him. "Ben, what happened?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What's going on?" He didn't answer immediately. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, his body trembling as if he couldn't control it. "I saw it," he whispered. It was right behind me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it, breathing down my neck. We all looked around, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The woods were eerily silent again, but the feeling of something watching us, something lurking in the shadows, was undeniable. Ben, we need to go. Now, I said, pulling him to his feet. He didn't argue. We hurried back to the camp, but it felt like we were being followed. The rustling, the footsteps, they were back. But this time, they were closer. Much closer. As we reached the clearing, something moved in the shadows just beyond the firelight. It was tall, too tall, its form indistinct, a shadow within a shadow. It seemed to shift with the trees as if it was one with the forest itself. We froze. The air felt thick, suffocating. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears as the figure stepped forward. It was the outline of a person, but it wasn't right. It was wrong. Its arms were unnaturally long, stretching down to its knees, and it seemed to sway with the movement of the trees. There was no face, only a void where its features should have been. It stepped closer, and I could feel the air grow colder, the world around me growing darker. It felt like time itself had stopped. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted toward the cars, not daring to look back. But as we ran, I could hear the footsteps behind us, matching our pace, always just a step behind. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, the path we had come from now, a labyrinth of twisting trees and dark shadows. We finally reached the cars and scrambled inside. I started the engine, and we sped away, not daring to stop until we reached the safety of the nearest town. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't truly alone. The next day, we contacted the local authorities, but they found nothing. No signs of anything unusual, no strange tracks, no evidence of a disturbance. The woods were silent as if nothing had ever happened. But I know what I saw. I know what we felt. There's something in those woods. Something ancient, something that doesn't belong to this world. I can't explain it, and I can't forget it. I don't know if it was a ghost or something far darker, but I do know this. Those woods are not safe, and I'll never go back. Get ready for more spooky stories. Don't forget to subscribe.
Next story.
I don't know if I should be telling you this, but something has been haunting me for weeks now. It started when I took that trip into the woods. I was looking for a little peace and quiet, something to clear my mind, you know? But I never thought it would turn into this. You think you know the woods, right? You think you can handle a night or two out there, away from civilization. But the deep woods, those forests where no one dares go for a reason, that's a whole different story. It wasn't even supposed to be that far out. I had heard of a secluded spot, some kind of hidden place in the Appalachian range, where people talked about a cabin no one ever seemed to use. Sounded perfect, honestly. It was off the grid, far from the usual tourist traps and weekend hikers. That was the goal. A couple of days alone, just me and the forest. No distractions, no noise. I arrived at the trailhead in the late afternoon, a heavy mist already starting to gather as the sun sank low. The path was narrow, winding through trees so dense it felt like I was walking through an endless tunnel of shadow. But I wasn't scared. It's just a forest, right? The further I went in, the more unsettling it became. The trees, they were huge, taller than any I'd seen before. They were so thick, their gnarled branches twisting together above me, blocking out the light. And the air, it was thick, too thick. Heavy with the scent of decay, things rotting unseen in the underbrush. Every few steps I'd hear something snapping in the distance, branches breaking, or maybe animal footsteps, but it didn't sound right. There was something deliberate about it. I told myself it was just the forest, just animals. I kept going. By nightfall, I found the cabin, or rather, what was left of it. The wood was dark, almost black in the dim light, and the structure leaned precariously to one side. It was old, abandoned, no lights, no sign of life, but it felt wrong. Even though the door was wide open, I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The interior was a mess, cobwebs, dust, broken furniture, but there was something else, something I couldn't put my finger on. The air inside was colder than outside, and the floor creaked in strange, uneven ways as I moved. I tried to shake off the feeling that someone or something had been there just before me. I set up my sleeping bag near the fireplace, lit a small fire, and tried to get comfortable. It didn't help. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd hear the crack of a branch outside, the soft shuffle of footsteps, but when I checked, there was nothing. Nothing but the trees standing in their ancient stillness. The hours dragged on, and the wind started picking up. The trees swayed, their branches creaking like old bones. I finally managed to fall into a restless sleep, but it wasn't long before something woke me. It started as a whisper, a soft voice at the edge of my consciousness. I thought it was the wind at first, but then it got clearer, louder. It was a voice, a raspy, breathy thing, barely a whisper, but it was right there in my ear. It said my name, John. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The voice was wrong. It wasn't human. It didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. I snapped awake, my breath shallow, and I looked around the cabin. Nothing. The fire still flickered on the hearth, casting long shadows across the room, but there was no one there. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, that I was imagining things. But that voice, it wasn't a dream. I could still feel it, like it was lingering in the air. I couldn't stay there. I grabbed my bag, hurriedly packed my things, and decided to head back to the trail. Maybe I just made a mistake. Maybe it wasn't the right place. But the woods outside, those woods had changed. They didn't look the same anymore. The trees seemed to loom closer, the darkness pressing in, and the path I had followed in was gone. I couldn't see it. I couldn't remember which way to go. Panic set in. I took off in what I thought was the right direction, but the more I walked, the deeper into the woods I seemed to go. The trees felt alive, moving around me. Shadows seemed to shift in the corner of my vision. I could hear them now, the soft, unnatural footsteps following behind me, just out of sight. And then, the laughter. It was low at first, almost like a growl. Then, slowly, it became more distinct, like a group of children playing. But they weren't real children. I could hear their voices, but they didn't sound right. They sounded hollow, distant, like echoes from somewhere far beyond the forest. I spun around, but I saw nothing, just trees. I kept moving, my breath ragged, my feet slipping in the wet, uneven ground. The further I went, the more disoriented I became. Nothing looked familiar. The trees, the rocks, the underbrush, they all seemed to shift and warp around me. My mind was starting to unravel. Was I lost, or was I being led somewhere? I heard the voice again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a low, guttural growl, like something was standing right behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but still, nothing. The path was gone, the trees were closing in, and then I saw it. In the distance, just beyond the trees, there was a faint, flickering light. A lantern, swinging back and forth, casting strange, shifting shadows. I knew I had to reach it, but as I started to move toward it, I felt it. The ground beneath my feet shifting, like something was pulling me down. I fell to my knees. I couldn't move. It was like the earth itself was grabbing at me, holding me in place. My legs felt heavy, my body frozen. The lantern light flickered again, growing brighter, coming closer. I could see it now, a figure cloaked in darkness, standing just at the edge of the light. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. Its face was a void, nothing but darkness, like it had no features, no eyes, but I could feel it watching me. The voice came again, this time all around me, echoing in my skull. You shouldn't have come here. And then, as if by command, the trees began to move. The branches reached out, closing in on me, trapping me in place. The figure stepped forward, and I felt the cold of its presence wash over me. You will never leave, it whispered, its voice like the wind, but darker, colder. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The trees were closing in, the darkness swallowing everything. I knew then I was never meant to find my way out. I don't know how I got back to the cabin, but somehow I ended up there again, lying on the cold floor, unable to move. The fire had long since gone out, and the night was deep. The shadows stretched long, impossibly long, across the room. I never made it out of those woods. I tried. I really did. But there's no way back once you've crossed into that place. It's like the forest itself has a hold on you, a grip you can't shake. And now, every night I hear the whispers, soft at first, then growing louder, always calling my name. John, I can't escape. I don't think I ever will. I'm still here, lost in the woods. And I'm telling you this now because if you ever find yourself out there, don't go too far. Don't let the trees draw you in. They'll take you, and you'll never leave. Don't let these tales of terror end here. Subscribe for more and join our haunted family.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a break from the chaotic life I'd been living, a weekend retreat in the wilderness, just me, a few friends, and the great outdoors. I didn't expect to encounter anything out of the ordinary, But that's the thing about the woods. They have a way of hiding things, things you're better off never knowing. The plan was simple. We'd drive up to a remote cabin deep in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, a place we'd rented for the weekend. It was far from civilization, with no neighbors for miles, and it was exactly what we needed to disconnect and recharge. At least, that's what we thought. The drive up was long, with winding roads that seemed to disappear into the towering trees. The forest was dense, with no signs of life beyond the occasional bird call or rustling leaves. By the time we arrived at the cabin, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting an eerie twilight over everything. It was the kind of place where everything felt still, as if the world was holding its breath. There were 5 of us: me, my best friend Lily, her boyfriend Adam, and 2 others from college. After unpacking and getting settled in, we sat around the living room, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over us. The house itself wasn't much to look at, an old, weathered cabin with creaky floors and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. But it had character, and that was enough for us. We lit a fire and opened a few bottles of wine. As the night wore on, we began to tell stories. Some were ghost stories, some were just creepy tales we'd heard. And that's when Lily's boyfriend, Adam, told us about something that made the air in the room grow heavy. He'd heard it from a friend of a friend who worked as a park ranger in the area. It was about a local legend, something the locals called the Watcher. The Watcher, as the story went, was a creature that lurked in the woods, stalking those who dared to venture too deep into the forest. No one really knew what it was. Some said it was a spirit. Others believed it was a monstrous creature that had somehow survived the centuries. But the one thing everyone agreed on was that it was always watching, always waiting for the right moment to strike. The story was a little unsettling, but I figured it was just that, a story, nothing to take seriously. But Lily seemed uneasy, glancing nervously out the cabin windows. I didn't think much of it, though, until later that night. Around midnight, after we had finished the wine and the fire had burned low, I decided to go outside for a breath of fresh air. The sky was clear, and the stars above were more numerous than I had ever seen before. The air smelled like pine and earth, and for a moment I felt at peace. But then I heard something. It was faint at first, a soft rustling sound coming from the tree line at the edge of the cabin's yard. I stopped and listened. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the usual noises you'd hear in the forest. It was deliberate, slow, like something was moving through the brush. I turned to head back inside, but before I could take a step, I saw it. A shadow at the edge of the trees. Just a dark, indistinct shape standing motionless, watching me. My heart skipped a beat, and my breath caught in my throat. It was too far away to make out any details, but I could feel its presence. It wasn't just an animal or a trick of the light. It was something wrong. I rushed back inside, closing the door behind me with a bang. My friends were still sitting around the fireplace, laughing and chatting. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I had to tell them what I'd seen. I could feel my hands trembling as I tried to explain. "I swear, I saw something out there," I said, my voice shaky. Something was watching me. At first, they all laughed it off, thinking I was just spooked by the creepy stories. But then Lily's face went pale. Her eyes were wide and her hands were clenched tightly around her mug. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We all froze. The sound was unmistakable. Footsteps, heavy, slow steps, coming from just outside the cabin. It wasn't the wind or any animal. The footsteps were too deliberate, too heavy. We all stood in silence, holding our breath as the sound drew nearer. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. There was a moment of complete stillness, as if the entire world had paused. And then a soft, scratching sound came from the door. It was slow, deliberate, like something was trying to claw its way inside. "Go check it out, Adam," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I wanted to sound brave, but I couldn't help the fear creeping into my words. Adam stood up hesitantly, his eyes darting to the door. He grabbed a nearby flashlight and walked slowly toward it. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him as he reached for the handle. Suddenly, the door burst open, and Adam was thrown back against the wall, landing with a heavy thud. We all screamed, rushing to his side. But there was nothing outside. The door had opened on its own, the wind slamming it with such force that it had knocked Adam back. I couldn't understand what was happening. There was no explanation for any of it, but we weren't alone. That night, we barricaded ourselves in the cabin, listening to the sounds of footsteps and scratching at the door. It wasn't just one person. It wasn't just the wind. There were multiple shapes moving around the cabin, circling us like they were waiting for something. As the night dragged on, we noticed something else, shadowy figures moving outside the windows. They weren't human, though. They were tall, impossibly thin, and their limbs seemed to stretch unnaturally. Their faces, if you could call them that, were just voids, black, empty spaces where eyes should have been. The Watcher, it seemed, wasn't a legend at all. It was real, and it wasn't alone. By the time dawn broke, the creatures outside had vanished, and the woods were eerily quiet again. But we couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching, still waiting. We packed up and left the cabin as soon as we could. None of us spoke much on the drive back, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The woods were silent behind us, but I knew that whatever it was that had watched us that night, it was still there, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting souls to venture too far. The worst part is, I can still feel it sometimes. That sense of being watched. And when the wind rustles through the trees, I wonder if it's just the wind or something else. Enjoyed this story? Make sure to subscribe for your next terrifying tale.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a simple road trip, one of those spontaneous adventures where the goal is nothing more than to get lost for a little while. My friends and I had decided to drive through the back roads of Wyoming, away from the bustling highways and the noise of the world. Just a few days of nothing but endless stretches of road, country towns, and quiet nights. What we didn't know was that our trip would take us somewhere we would never forget. It was late afternoon when we took a wrong turn, one of those moments where we missed a sign or got distracted by the landscape. We had been driving for hours, and the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains. The light was fading quickly, and I could feel a growing unease in the pit of my stomach. "We should have passed a town by now," said Jason, the driver, his eyes scanning the empty road ahead. "Yeah, but it's still early," I replied, trying to sound reassuring. "We're probably just off the beaten path. Let's keep going." But as the miles stretched on and the sky darkened, I began to feel that something wasn't quite right. The trees on either side of the road grew thicker, taller, like they were closing in on us. The air became heavy, thick with tension. The road seemed to wind in a way that felt unnatural, twisting back on itself like we were going in circles. I glanced out of the window and saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man, tall and thin, almost unnaturally so. He was standing perfectly still, just watching us as we drove by. I blinked, and when I looked again, he was gone. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. Jason raised an eyebrow, looking at me. "See what?" "There was someone standing in the woods," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "He was just watching us." Jason laughed nervously. "You're seeing things. It's just the dark playing tricks on you." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was an eerie stillness to the air, like the world had gone quiet, waiting for something. It didn't take long for me to realize that Jason was starting to get uneasy too. "I'm not liking this," he muttered, glancing at the gas gauge. "We're low on fuel. There's no sign of a gas station anywhere. Maybe we should turn around." "Yeah, let's go back," I agreed. I didn't care how much time we'd lost. I just wanted to be out of this place. But when we turned the car around, the road behind us wasn't the same. The familiar landmarks we'd passed, those tall trees, the narrow bend in the road, were all gone. Instead, we were surrounded by an endless stretch of dark forest, with no end in sight. "We're not in the same place," Jason said, his voice rising with panic. "This doesn't make sense." I looked out of the window, and that's when I saw it again. The figure. This time there were more of them, several of them, standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. Their pale faces were turned toward us, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I could feel the fear crawling up my spine. "We need to get out of here. Now." Jason floored the gas pedal, but no matter how fast he drove, the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, never leading us out of the woods. The figures, those tall, thin shadows, began to appear more frequently, growing in number the further we drove. They didn't move, just stood there, watching. Every time we passed one, I could feel their eyes on us, drilling into the car like they were pulling us deeper into the forest. "We're trapped," Jason whispered, his voice cracking. "What do you mean, trapped?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "We can't be trapped. We'll find our way out." But the trees were closing in around us. The road seemed to narrow, the shadows darker and the air heavier. Every time I looked out the window, the figures were closer. Their faces, pale and gaunt, seemed to shimmer in the dim light as though they were not entirely part of this world. "Look, there's something up ahead," Jason said, his voice desperate. "A cabin. We need to stop." I wasn't sure if it was a good idea, but it was the only option we had. The car pulled up in front of a small, run-down cabin that looked abandoned. Its windows were cracked, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. The figures had stopped following us for a moment, but they were still out there, lurking just beyond the trees. "We need to go inside," Jason said, turning the car off. "We'll figure this out. We'll get help." We didn't even make it to the door before we heard the first knock. It was soft at first, a tapping sound from somewhere in the darkness. We froze, but the tapping continued, growing louder. It wasn't the wind or an animal. It was deliberate, like someone or something was trying to get our attention. The cabin door creaked open slowly, as if it were being pushed by an invisible hand. We didn't dare go inside. That's when the voices began. At first, it was just whispers, soft, indecipherable murmurs, as though they were coming from all around us. Then the whispers became clearer, forming words, but not in a language I could understand. The figures in the trees began to move, stepping closer, their eyes still fixed on us. And then one of them stepped forward. The man, tall, thin, and gaunt, with hollow eyes, walked slowly toward us. He opened his mouth, and what came out was a voice, deep and echoing, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. "You shouldn't have come here," it said. Before I could react, the figures surged forward, their faces twisted in an expression of something between anger and despair. The world around us seemed to warp and shift, the trees bending and distorting, the ground trembling beneath our feet. We ran. We ran faster than we had ever run in our lives, back to the car. But it was no use. The woods had swallowed us whole. The road didn't lead anywhere anymore. There was only darkness, and those creatures with their cold, empty eyes. The next thing I remember, I was waking up on the side of the road. The sun was rising, and the trees had disappeared. The road was straight, and I could see the familiar landmarks of a nearby town in the distance. It was as if we had been erased from that place. Jason and the others were gone. I tried to tell people what happened, but no one believed me. They said I had been dreaming, that it was just some weird hallucination. But I know what I saw. I know what happened, and I can still hear their whispers sometimes, faint in the background of my thoughts. Don't go back. I never will. Want more thrill and suspense? Hit subscribe now and stay haunted with our ghost stories.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a camping trip. Just a few friends escaping the noise of the city to enjoy the fresh air and the quiet of the wilderness. We were used to hiking and spending nights in the woods, but this time we decided to go off the beaten path. We'd been hearing rumors about an old abandoned campsite deep in the forest where hikers had once disappeared, but we didn't take them seriously. After all, it was just a story, right? The day we set out, everything was perfect. The weather was cool, the sky clear, and we had plenty of supplies. The hike was long, but we didn't mind. We laughed, took pictures, and even had a few beers along the way. We followed the trail as it twisted deeper into the woods, the trees growing denser, the air thick with the smell of pine. As night approached, we reached the area where the abandoned campsite was rumored to be. It didn't take much to find it. It was hidden in a clearing, surrounded by trees that seemed to close in on us. The fire pit was cold, the old tent frames were partially collapsed, and rusted cooking utensils were scattered on the ground. "This place gives me the creeps," said Ryan, one of my friends. He was always the more cautious one, the one who didn't take risks. "It's fine," I said, trying to sound confident. "Just an old campsite. We'll set up, have a fire, and relax." We set up our tents near the old fire pit and started gathering wood. As the fire crackled to life, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the eerie silence of the forest. It felt as if we were being watched. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I noticed something. At the edge of the clearing, Just beyond the reach of the firelight, there was a figure. It was standing perfectly still, its shape barely visible in the dark. I pointed it out to my friends, but by the time they turned to look, it was gone. Probably just an animal, Ryan said, though his voice had a nervous edge to it. I wasn't so sure. There was something about the way it had been standing, motionless, like it was waiting. But I let it go. We laughed it off and drank a little more, trying to push the feeling of unease to the back of our minds. But then, strange things started happening. First, we heard noises. Soft, distant footsteps, like someone was walking around the campsite. But when we checked, no one was there. Then, one of the tents started shaking. We thought it was just the wind, but it didn't feel like wind. It felt like, someone was trying to get inside. "That's it," Ryan said, looking panicked. "I'm out. I'm not staying here another minute." But before any of us could react, we heard it. A voice, low and raspy, coming from the dark woods. "Help." It was just a whisper, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. It wasn't human. It didn't sound right. We all froze, staring into the blackness beyond the fire. There was a long silence, and then the voice came again. "Help." This time it was louder, closer. "Who's out there?" I shouted, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" But there was no response, just the rustling of leaves and the sound of something moving in the trees. "Okay, that's it. I'm getting the hell out of here," Ryan said, his voice shaking. He grabbed his flashlight and started toward the trail. "No, Ryan, wait," I called, but he was already halfway to the path, his footsteps hasty. We were about to follow when we heard it, a loud, bone-chilling scream. It wasn't human, not by any stretch of the imagination. It sounded like something inhuman was in pain. Without thinking, we rushed toward the scream, our flashlights sweeping through the trees. The forest was thick, and every step felt like it was taking us deeper into something we didn't understand. That's when we found it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees, we saw Ryan. He was standing there, frozen in place, staring at something with wide, horrified eyes. His flashlight was pointed at the ground, shaking in his hand. Then we saw what he was staring at. It was a figure, crouched low to the ground. Its skin was pale, sickly white, and it had long, thin limbs that seemed to stretch and bend in unnatural ways. Its face, if you could call it that, was covered in dark, matted hair, and its eyes were large and black, empty like pits. It wasn't human. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. "Ryan?" I shouted, but he didn't respond. He was completely entranced by the creature, his mouth hanging open as if he couldn't look away. I moved toward him, pulling him back, but it was too late. The creature hissed, a sound so terrifying that it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It reached out with its long, spindly arms and grabbed Ryan's wrist. The moment it touched him, his body went limp, as though the life had been drained from him in an instant. We couldn't move. We were frozen in terror as the creature slowly pulled Ryan toward it, its mouth opening wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. The last thing we heard was his scream, a desperate cry for help that was quickly silenced as the creature dragged him into the darkness. Panic set in. We didn't know what to do, where to go, or how to save him. We stumbled back, tripping over roots and branches, the creature's low growls echoing behind us. When we finally made it back to the campsite, the fire was nearly out, casting long, eerie shadows. The creature's presence still lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. We didn't dare stay another minute. We grabbed what we could, and without a word, we ran. We ran all the way back to the road, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. But by then, the sun was rising, and the forest seemed as quiet as ever, as if nothing had happened at all. We never went back to those woods, and we never spoke of that night again. But I still hear the whispers sometimes. Late at night, when the wind is still and the air is thick, I hear that voice, faint but clear, "Help." And I know, deep down, that Ryan never made it out of those woods. And whatever it was that took him, it's still out there, waiting for its next victim. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to subscribe and be a part of our haunting journey.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts, not until that night in the woods. I've always thought that the stories people tell about haunted places, especially in deep forests, were just that, stories. But that was before I experienced the terror that still haunts me. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just a weekend with a few friends in the deep woods, a secluded area that had long been a local legend. Everyone had heard the rumors, whispers about strange happenings and lost souls, but we laughed them off. We were all seasoned hikers and campers. It was just another trip, right? We set up camp in a spot that seemed perfect. It was quiet, with no one around for miles. We joked, cooked some food, and cracked open a few beers. As night fell, we sat around the campfire, telling ghost stories, typical camping stuff. But there was something off about that night, something I couldn't put my finger on. The forest felt too still. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were missing. It was eerily quiet. I didn't think much of it at the time, just chalked it up to the oddities of the woods. But as the fire flickered, I noticed something strange. In the distance, there was a shape moving, just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was barely noticeable at first, just a shadow among the trees. My friends didn't seem to notice, too busy with their stories and laughs. But I couldn't take my eyes off it. I leaned over to Jake, who was sitting beside me, and whispered, "Do you see that?" He looked up, squinting into the dark. "What? I don't see anything." I pointed, but as I did, the shape seemed to move further away, swallowed by the darkness. My heart skipped a beat, but I tried to shake it off. It was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or some other creature moving through the trees, but it didn't feel like an animal. Later that night, after everyone had gone to sleep, I was lying in my tent, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The forest outside felt suffocating, oppressive, like it was closing in on us. I heard the occasional snap of a twig or rustle in the underbrush. But when I opened the flap of the tent, there was nothing there. I rolled over and tried to sleep, but then I heard something else. A voice, soft but distinct. It wasn't one of my friends. It was a whisper, a low murmur coming from somewhere deep in the woods. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the voice grew clearer. It was calling my name. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. "Tyler," it whispered again, dragging the syllables out. "Tyler, come find me." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body felt paralyzed. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe properly. My mind raced with questions. Was it one of my friends playing a prank? But why? They were all asleep. Then the whisper came again, this time louder, more desperate. "Come to me. Come to the woods, Tyler." I don't know what possessed me, but I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the night, my feet carrying me toward the sound, despite every bone in my body telling me to turn back. The cold air hit my face, and the silence of the woods wrapped around me like a shroud. The forest was different now. The trees loomed taller, their branches twisting like skeletal arms reaching for the sky. The moon barely filtered through the thick canopy above, casting the ground in a sickly, pale light. The whispering voice echoed through the trees, luring me further in. I don't know how long I walked. Minutes? Hours? It didn't matter. Time seemed to bend in that place. The further I went, the more the trees seemed to close in around me. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. Then suddenly, I stopped. I don't know why. It was like something in my gut told me to stop, to pay attention. And that's when I saw it. In the clearing ahead, illuminated by the pale light of the moon, was a figure. A woman. She stood perfectly still, her back to me, staring into the darkness. Her hair hung long and wild, tangled with leaves and twigs. She wore a tattered white dress that fluttered in the breeze, though there was no wind. Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she slowly turned toward me, and I felt a cold chill crawl up my spine. Her face, oh God, her face was pale, deathly pale. Her eyes were hollow like dark voids, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile that didn't belong on a human being. "Help me," she whispered, but it didn't sound like a plea. It was like a command. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The ground beneath me felt soft, like it was sinking. The woman took a step toward me, and I could hear the sickening crunch of twigs underfoot. My vision blurred, and my heart hammered in my chest. She reached out a bony hand, and in that moment I knew I was trapped. Suddenly, the world around me shifted. The trees, the ground, everything seemed to swirl and distort. The whispers turned into screams, screams of agony, of fear, of something far worse than death. The woman's form began to melt, her body disintegrating into a cloud of shadows that writhed and twisted. And then I saw them. Faces. Hundreds, thousands of faces, all twisted in pain and terror, emerging from the shadows. They were the souls of the lost, trapped in the woods. Their eyes followed me, begging for release, but there was no escape. I stumbled backward, my legs giving way beneath me, and I fell to the ground, gasping for breath. The last thing I saw before I blacked out was the woman's face, now inches from mine, her smile widening, her hollow eyes consuming everything. When I woke up, I was back at camp. The fire had long since burned out and the sun was rising, casting a pale light over the campsite. My friends were still asleep, as if nothing had happened. But I knew something had changed. I could still hear the whispers, faint but ever present in the back of my mind. They were always there now, just beneath the surface. I could never escape them, never escape the woods. I told my friends what happened, but they didn't believe me. They said I must have had a nightmare, that I was just scared and hallucinated the whole thing. But deep down, I knew the truth. The deep woods are alive. They're filled with souls that can never rest. And once they've found you, they never let you go. The worst part, I don't think I was the first. I don't think I was even the last. There's a part of me that wonders if those faces, those twisted souls, are still out there in the woods, waiting for the next person to wander too close, waiting for them to listen to the whispers. And part of me fears that I'm still being hunted, that I'm not truly alone. Don't miss out on more hauntingly good stories. Subscribe now.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts. I used to scoff at stories of haunted woods and creatures lurking in the dark. But after that weekend, I don't know what to believe anymore. You have to understand, I went into those woods with a sense of curiosity, not fear. I thought I was prepared. I thought nothing could happen to me. It all started with a camping trip. I've always been the outdoors type, hiking, camping, you name it. But I wanted something more isolated this time, something away from the usual crowds and weekend warriors. A friend of mine told me about a spot in the deep woods, a place far off any trail, a place where most people didn't even know existed. It seemed perfect, a private place to disconnect from everything. So I packed up my gear, rented a car, and set off. The woods were thicker than I expected. No light seeped through the dense canopy of trees, and the only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves or distant bird calls. I parked at the base of a small hill and started my hike up the narrow path. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows as I made my way deeper. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with vines and thick shrubs. I didn't mind. I liked the challenge. It was around the time the sun started to dip below the horizon that I reached the clearing. The air was colder here, as if the trees themselves had absorbed the warmth of the day and held onto it, unwilling to share. In the center of the clearing, there was an old cabin. It looked like something out of a forgotten dream, shabby, weathered, with cracked windows and a sagging roof. But something about it drew me in. The place had an eerie feeling, like it had been waiting for someone to come. I set up my tent near the cabin. I wasn't planning on staying inside. I just figured the structure would provide some sort of shelter if the weather took a turn. The wind picked up as night fell, and the temperature dropped rapidly. I lit a fire, trying to ignore the strange chill in the air, and sat back to relax. It was peaceful, but there was something unsettling about the place. The cabin seemed to watch me, the dark windows like hollow eyes staring from the shadows. That night, I fell asleep with the fire crackling beside me, the wind howling through the trees. But I woke up to a noise, a faint scratching sound like nails on wood. I froze, listening. It came again, this time louder. My heart began to race as the sound grew more insistent, scratching at the cabin door. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my breath coming in shallow bursts. I moved toward the door, the light flickering in my trembling hands. The air felt colder than it had any right to be. There was nothing out there, just the night, silent and still. The scratching had stopped. I went back to the fire, my mind racing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods were too quiet now. I tried to settle back into my tent, but sleep wouldn't come. Around midnight, the scratching started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the woods, from the trees, from the ground beneath me. The sound moved, circling my camp, first to the left, then to the right. Always near, always just out of reach. It was as if something was trying to claw its way out of the earth. I grabbed my pack and went to the cabin, hoping the walls would offer me some kind of protection. The door creaked open and I stepped inside. The place felt colder than before, like the temperature dropped by a few degrees in an instant. I turned on my flashlight and looked around. The inside of the cabin was just as decayed as the outside, dust and cobwebs everywhere. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I walked deeper into the darkness. Then I saw it. In the far corner, there was a pile of old furniture, chairs, tables, shelves, all stacked haphazardly. But beneath it, half hidden in shadow, was something more, something that didn't belong. It was a shape, a figure, not human. It was hunched, its limbs long and twisted, its body pale and unnatural. It had no face, just a smooth, white surface where its head should be. And it was staring right at me. I screamed, stumbling backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, its intent. It wasn't here by accident. It was waiting for me. The scratching sound had returned, louder now, closer, as if the thing in the corner was calling out to something. I couldn't breathe. I turned to run, but as I reached for the door, I heard a voice. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakably clear. Leave now. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted from the cabin and didn't look back. The woods felt like they were alive, pressing in on me, the trees groaning with each step I took. I ran, the path barely visible, the flashlight flickering in my hand as I sprinted through the underbrush. The scratching followed me, getting louder, like something was right behind me. By the time I reached my car, I was shaking uncontrollably. I fumbled with the keys, desperately trying to get the door open, my eyes darting around in panic. The scratching had stopped, but the air felt thick, suffocating. I didn't feel safe. Not anymore. I drove out of there as fast as I could, never once looking in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road. And even then, I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I never told anyone about what happened. I couldn't. Who would believe me? They'd say I was just spooked, that it was just an animal, just my imagination. But it wasn't. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that cabin. I don't know if it was a ghost, some kind of creature, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing. I'll never go back into those woods again. And if you ever hear someone mention the deep woods near the Appalachian range, you'd be wise to stay away too. Feeling spooked? Subscribe for more terrifying tales that will send chills down your spine.
Next story.
I'll never forget that night. It changed everything for me. Before then, I had always been a skeptic, too logical for anything supernatural to even cross my mind. But what happened on that night in the remote woods of Maine? That was different. I can't explain it, and I don't think I ever will. It all began when I decided to go on a solo hike. I'd been feeling burned out lately, just coming off a long stretch of work, and I figured I'd spend a weekend in the wilderness to clear my head. I was staying at a small cabin, rented out by a local couple who owned a patch of forested land about 15 miles outside of town. It was remote, quiet, and perfect for what I needed. No distractions, just me, the trees, and the air. The first day was beautiful. The sun was out, the sky was clear, and the trails were easy to follow. I'd hike, then stop to rest by a stream, where I'd sit and listen to the water, feeling the peace of nature settle into me. It felt like everything was right in the world. But as the day wore on, something started to feel off. Not immediately, but slowly. The woods grew quieter. The birds stopped singing. The breeze stopped rustling the leaves. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath. That's when I noticed it. The strange, low hum in the air. It wasn't the wind or the trees. It was like a constant vibration, a buzzing noise, almost like static on a radio. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was just imagining things. Maybe it was a distant generator from a neighboring cabin, or maybe I was just tired. But the hum grew louder, closer. It began to gnaw at my nerves. I decided to head back to the cabin early, hoping that a good meal and a quiet night would help me shake off the feeling. But as I retraced my steps down the trail, the humming grew more intense. I could feel it vibrating through the ground, through the soles of my boots. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, something barely visible among the trees, standing still in the distance. My first instinct was to walk faster, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the trail and toward the shape. As I got closer, I realized what it was. A figure, standing at the edge of a small clearing, bathed in the soft golden light of the fading sun. It was a person. or at least it looked like a person, but something was wrong. The figure was unnaturally tall, almost disturbingly so, with long limbs that seemed to stretch out of proportion. And there was no face, no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, blank surface where its head should have been. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, perfectly still. I felt the blood drain from my face. My heart began to race, and the hum in the air intensified, vibrating in my chest. The figure wasn't just standing, it was watching me. I could feel it, even though it had no face. I don't know how to explain it. It was as though it was looking right into me, into my very soul. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran, but I didn't stop until I reached the cabin. I slammed the door behind me and locked it. The hum was still there, though, buzzing in my ears, vibrating the walls of the cabin. I sat on the floor, my back against the door, trying to catch my breath, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure in the clearing, standing motionless, its faceless head turned toward me. I kept hearing that hum, vibrating through the floorboards, through the walls. It was impossible to escape. Around 3 a.m., I heard something at the door. Soft tapping, almost like a knock. Then it stopped. And then a voice. Soft, distant, like it was coming from the other side of the door, barely audible. Help? My heart leaped into my throat. The voice sounded human, but the words didn't feel right. They were strained, like they didn't belong. Help, it repeated, louder this time. But still, the voice didn't sound real. It was hollow, distorted, like it was being spoken through some kind of filter. My body was frozen with fear, unable to move or even breathe. Then, silence. Complete silence. I waited, terrified that whatever it was on the other side of the door would force its way inside. I didn't know how long I sat there, listening, but eventually, the hum in the air began to fade. The atmosphere in the cabin lightened, and the weight on my chest began to lift. It felt like whatever had been outside was finally gone, at least for the moment. The next day, I packed my things and left the cabin before sunrise. I didn't want to take any chances, not after everything that happened. When I passed through the woods again, there was no sign of the figure. The humming was gone, and the forest seemed back to normal. But the memory of that night, the figure without a face, and the strange voice, it lingered. Back in town, I didn't tell anyone what had happened. They'd probably think I was crazy, or at least exaggerating. But deep down, I knew what I saw. I knew what I felt, and what I encountered that night in the woods. It wasn't something I could explain. I don't know what it was, whether it was a spirit, some kind of creature, or something else entirely, but I know that it wasn't human. I've never gone back to those woods. I don't think I ever will. Every time I hear a strange hum or a distant tapping sound, I can't help but feel that it's calling me back to that place, to the figure that stood in the clearing, waiting, watching. And I'm not sure I want to know what it wants. Want more spine-chilling stories? Hit the subscribe button now.
Next story.
I don't know how to begin this. I've been trying to make sense of what happened, but the more I think about it, the more I feel like I'm losing my grip on reality. It started as a routine hunting trip. Just me and my buddy Ted. We'd been out there 100 times before, hiking through the dense forests of Oregon, far away from the nearest town. Nothing strange had ever happened, but this time was different. We'd been tracking deer for hours. The day was crisp, with the sun filtering through the canopy of trees. The air smelled fresh, clean, just the way I liked it. Ted was a few steps ahead of me, moving quietly through the brush, his rifle slung over his shoulder. We weren't really talking much. That's how it usually went. Silent, focused, moving as one with the woods. We had stopped for a quick break, resting by a stream, when things began to feel off. At first, it was just a sense, like the woods were watching us. The birds had stopped singing, and there was this deep, unsettling silence. I looked over at Ted, who was staring into the trees with a distant look in his eyes. I called his name a few times, but he didn't respond. "Hey, Ted, you good?" Finally, he turned to me, his face pale. I don't know, man. Something's not right here." His voice was shaky, and that freaked me out. Ted was the toughest guy I knew, never rattled by anything. If he was nervous, then something was definitely wrong. Before I could ask him what he meant, there was a noise, a snap of a twig, sharp and loud, like something heavy had stepped on it. We both froze. I looked around, but the woods were still, too still. "What was that?" I whispered. Ted didn't answer. He slowly got to his feet and started walking in the direction of the sound. I followed, my heart pounding in my chest. We moved carefully, staying low, trying to avoid making noise. The sun was beginning to set, and the shadows grew long and strange. Then we saw it. A figure. No, a shape, standing between two massive oak trees. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe an animal, but then it shifted. It was tall, too tall, and it wasn't moving like an animal. It was standing perfectly still, facing us, its shape too unnatural. It didn't have the proportions of a human, but it was standing upright like a person. I felt my stomach twist, and Ted grabbed my arm. "We need to go. Now." I didn't argue. We turned around and started walking fast, then jogging, then running. I could hear the sound of something behind us, keeping pace. It wasn't footsteps. It wasn't the rustle of leaves. It was more like a dragging sound, like something scraping against the ground, slow and deliberate. We reached the edge of the forest where the trees started thinning out, but the sound was still there, following us. I glanced over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it again. The figure, now much closer, standing between the trees, just outside the line of sight. It didn't chase us, though. It didn't need to. It was like it was just waiting for us to come closer. We finally made it to the clearing where we had parked the truck. Ted got the keys out of his pocket and fumbled with them, his hands shaking. We didn't speak. There was no need to. We both knew something was out there, something that didn't belong. We jumped into the truck, slammed the doors shut, and Ted started the engine. But as soon as the headlights swept over the trees, I saw it again. The figure was standing just at the edge of the clearing, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. And then, to my horror, it moved. Slowly, deliberately. Ted slammed his foot on the gas, and we tore out of there like our lives depended on it. We didn't stop until we hit the nearest town, nearly an hour away. We pulled into a gas station, both of us breathing heavily, hearts racing. Ted just sat there for a moment, staring at the steering wheel, his knuckles white from gripping it so tight. He didn't say anything for the longest time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "I don't know what we saw, but I've been hunting these woods for years, and I've never seen anything like that. We need to get out of here. Never come back." I agreed, but it wasn't until much later that night when I was in bed that I realized something wasn't right. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure. I didn't know what it was, but it was like it was watching me. I didn't tell Ted, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I could still feel it out there, somewhere in the woods, waiting. The next morning, Ted and I packed up our things and left the town. Neither of us mentioned the woods again, but I know what I saw. I can still hear that dragging sound sometimes when the wind is just right, when it's quiet enough that all I can hear is the creaking of the trees. The thought crosses my mind that it's out there, still waiting, still watching. Maybe it follows people who ventured too deep into the woods. Maybe it's drawn to anyone who gets too close. I don't know, but I won't go back to find out. And I'll tell you this, if you ever find yourself in the deep woods, far away from any trail, don't stop. Don't look around. Just turn around and leave. Don't wait to see if it's behind you. Trust me, you don't want to know. Scared yet? Subscribe for more tales from the dark side that'll send shivers down your spine.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts, at least not until I took a trip out to the old Franklin Hollow. It wasn't exactly on my radar. I was just looking for a weekend getaway, some peace and quiet, you know? So when a friend of mine told me about a cabin out there in the middle of nowhere, I thought, why not? Little did I know, the trip would change everything. It was the kind of place most people don't visit, even locals. Franklin Hollow wasn't marked on any tourist map, and most people who lived nearby had stories about it, though none of them were willing to talk about it. The locals had a peculiar way of brushing off any questions about the area, like it was something best left untouched. But for someone like me, that only made it more appealing. I thought it was just some local superstition, something to do with old wives' tales and nothing more. I found the cabin easily enough, following an overgrown road that barely passed for a path. It was small, weathered by years of neglect, but solid enough. There was a strange, almost imperceptible odor in the air, like wet wood, but with something else beneath it. I figured it was just mildew or something from being abandoned for so long. I set up for the night, made a fire, and settled into the cabin. It was the quietest place I'd ever been. There was no sound, no wind rustling in the trees, no animals, not even the hum of electricity, just silence. It was unsettling, but I didn't mind it at first. After all, it was exactly what I had come for. That night, things started to get strange. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of something tapping against the window. It was a soft, rhythmic knock, not like the wind or any kind of animal. I sat up in bed, straining my ears to listen. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was trying to get my attention. At first, I thought it might just be the trees moving, the wind pushing branches against the cabin. But no, this was different. The knocks were precise, almost calculated. I got up and went to the window, peering out into the darkness. I saw nothing, just the trees, still as ever. I shook my head, thinking it was my imagination. I went back to bed, telling myself I was just hearing things. But the tapping didn't stop. It came again, a little louder this time, more insistent. I couldn't ignore it. Something was out there, something that wasn't right. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously stepped outside. The cold air hit me immediately, sharp and biting. The trees swayed gently, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. There were no animals, no rustling in the underbrush. Everything was eerily still. I turned the flashlight toward the cabin, scanning the area around it, and that's when I saw it, a figure standing just outside the light's reach. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with a hooded cloak that blended into the shadows. The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to notice me, just standing perfectly still, like it had been there for hours. My heart slammed in my chest. I didn't know who or what it was, but I knew one thing. I wasn't sticking around to find out. I backed away slowly, then turned and ran back into the cabin, slamming the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night in a state of hyper-alertness. The taps stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the woods. Every creak of the cabin, every breeze against the walls made my skin crawl. I kept thinking about the figure outside. Was it just some crazy person playing a prank? Or was it something else? Something? Not human? The morning light couldn't come soon enough. I packed my things quickly, practically throwing everything into the car. I drove away from Franklin Hollow without looking back, not even caring to check the rearview mirror. I wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. But even now, months later, I still feel its pull. Every now and then, when I'm alone in the quiet of my apartment, I hear that same tapping sound. It starts faintly, just like it did that night, tapping against my window. I'll wake up, my heart pounding, and for a second, I swear I'm back at that cabin, trapped in the woods with that thing watching me. I tell myself it's nothing, just the wind, just a tree branch moving against the glass, but the sound always comes back. I've moved to a new place since that trip, trying to escape whatever followed me, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll hear that tapping again, always in the same rhythm, always too perfect to be random. I don't know what I encountered out there in Franklin Hollow, but I do know one thing. It's not finished with me yet.